So it looks like maybe Hassan's running a little bit late, so I think we're just going to get started, inshallah ta'ala. Bismillah walhamdulillah, as-salatu was-salam ala rasulina wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. So this is our 10th lesson, and we only have basically the 10th, 11th, and 12th lesson left. So this is our third last lesson. So alhamdulillah, we're almost through the entire course. Today, what we're going to be looking at is scientific science, historical science, and future science of basically, prophetic verses essentially that prove the prophethood of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And we're going to obviously make the logical deduction here is that if the Prophet ﷺ got over 1,000 scientific proofs correct and multiple historical signs correct, and identified and revealed certain aspects of history that were not fully known to the people of that time, and then in the future predicted things that had not yet happened yet, then how is it logically possible for somebody to guess all of these things and get them all correct? By mere guesswork, it's not possible. So therefore, the logical deduction leads us to that this was revelation from the creator of the heavens and earth. We'll also look at signs of the inimitability of the Quran, which means that it is impossible for a human being to construct something that is equivalent to the Quran. And this is for many reasons: the linguistic features, the prophetic features of being able to depict things and clarify things that were not fully known to human beings at that time. And so we'll look at some examples of that, inshallah ta'ala. I think we may have missed just a few slides from the very last lesson, so I'm just going to quickly look at those, but they're actually within the context of the first learning objective of today's lesson. So if we just rewind to 3 slides ago, you'll see that there's essentially this timeline of different things happening within the past, and it's talking within the time frame of both Yusuf alayhi salam, who was obviously a Nabi, a prophet, and Prophet Musa alayhi salam, Prophet Moses, peace be upon him. And so the word Fir'aun, or Pharaoh in English, meant different things at different times. And the Quran pays attention to these nuances of fine detail, where you don't find this particular care to detail in the preservation of the Bible and how they spoke about the word Pharaoh in those 2 different time frames. So the word Pharaoh actually used to mean the word palace, and it would have meant that at the time of Yusuf alayhi salam. And that's why when you hear about who the king was at the time of Yusuf alayhi salam, the word Fir'aun is not mentioned in the Quran. The word Malik is mentioned in the Quran. And Malik, sorry, to be more accurate in my pronunciation, because Malik would be angel, but Malik is a king. So the word king is used in the case of the time of Yusuf alayhi salam, and also obviously in the Quran and the story of Yusuf alayhi salam, but the word Fir'aun is not mentioned. Later on, when we get to the story of Musa alayhi salam, then obviously continuously the word used is Fir'aun to refer to the king of that time. We're going to find this is important because the Bible doesn't make this distinction. The Bible always refers to Pharaoh at the time of Yusuf alayhi salam and the time of Musa alayhi salam. So why is this important? We'll take a look at that in a moment. If you hear my kids making noises in the background, it's because obviously I'm at home. Sorry about that. Looking at the word Malik, as I was saying earlier, if we look into the Bible, we look into the book of Genesis, chapter 41, verse 14 of the Old Testament, you will see that it says during the time of Yusuf alayhi salam, then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they brought him hastily out of the dungeon. And so this is the Old Testament. The word Pharaoh, which is Pera, at that time technically meant the word great house or a royal palace. So this is during the Old Middle Kingdom period in the story of Yusuf alayhi salam. And then if we go to the Quran, we can see the word king is being used. The word Malik is being used. Alina, this is being recorded. You need to go play in a different room. Can you go that way? Thanks. So just next slide. So here is where the distinction becomes further clarified. It wasn't until the year 1799, which is around 225 years ago, that we discovered that the word that was, sorry, I can't focus when my kids are screaming at the same time. Sorry. Really hard to focus if my kids are jumping and screaming while I'm trying to teach while I'm being recorded. So when we look at the word Pharaoh, so we recently discovered with the Rosetta Stone, and maybe you guys have heard of the word Rosetta Stone before because there's some like famous software called the Rosetta Stone, and it's supposed to help people learn languages very quickly. The military endorsed it, and then it obviously became commercialized, and then a lot of people found out about it, and now you can just obviously buy it. The prices vary, obviously, right? Could be around $50 to $100. Sometimes you have to pay more depending on the language of the software. And so the software is supposed to help you learn languages quickly. Well, the actual Rosetta Stone was a large relic that was discovered. And this relic had 3 different languages on it. 2 that we knew, or at least some people in human civilization knew, and 1 language that was not really fully known to us. So Koine or classical Greek would have been known because this was the language of the New Testament. And so there are people today that can still decipher that language. Then there is the language of Phoenician, and it was considered to be unknown but able to decipher using this code. So sorry, I made a small mistake there. The Koine Greek was known, but 2 other languages were unknown. So because we had 1 language that we knew, and what the Rosetta Stone has is it has basically the same passage of information in 3 different languages. So we know 1 out of the 2. So basically by studying the first text, then we can understand the translation of the 2 other texts that share the same meaning. And so by using Koine Classical Greek, we were able to discover, or the people who discovered this Rosetta Stone were able to figure out the language and the structure and the spelling and the letters of Phoenician and how they're used, and also the Egyptian hieroglyphics. Well, the Egyptian hieroglyphics are going to be very important because obviously if we're looking at old ancient tombs and pyramids, and we're looking at the hieroglyphics, the ancient writing of the Egyptians, we can start to understand what happened in their lifetime. And it was only after doing that that we were able to identify from his scientific and historical perspective that there was a linguistic difference between the word Fir'aun during the time of Yusuf alayhi salam, meaning a great palace, and then later on the word for Pera or Pharaoh changed to the meaning of king in the time of Musa alayhi salam. So that was that specific historical type of miracle. Now, when we talk about scientific facts in general, it's important to understand that there's a difference between theory and scientific law. Our goal is not really technically to just try to find every situation where anything that science in the modern day context, whatever they say might be true, we shouldn't be jumping to try to find those conclusions in the Quran. The reason being is because if it's a scientific theory specifically, then it's not established fact. It's just, it could be true or it might not be true. So theories, they change over time. They develop. Sometimes they throw theories out. And we're going to look at an example of when that actually happened. And when it comes to scientific laws, then we're safe to kind of look within this territory or to make this comparison. And we're going to find that all the established laws that are related to ayat in the Quran are all accurate. So then in this case, we have nothing to worry about. But if there's something that's called a theory, we shouldn't be jumping and looking for trying to make those comparisons because science might change their mind 2, 3, 4, 5 times before they decide a theory is now considered to be a law. When it comes to resources that we can use, I remember when I first became Muslim, I converted when I was in Toronto. And alhamdulillah, it only took me actually, less than half a day to make my decision because, I had basically been waiting for this answer my entire life. And what I thought the Bible actually was trying to teach, I ended up realizing Islam was teaching this all along before I even knew Islam was even a religion that existed on earth. But that's a side point. What happened was that after I converted, it was literally the next day. It was in Ramadan, subhanAllah. I had to learn how to fast the next day. I had to learn how to pray the night of my conversion. And then in the morning, I had to wake up and pray my first Fajr. They made sure I woke up. I didn't realize that people would, wake up before Fajr time even and, prepare themselves in the masjid. I was sleeping in the attic upstairs of a mosque because I was in Toronto, just visiting, and they wanted me to stay at them for a few days. But we went to go do dawah on the first day because I converted around Maghrib time. So the first technical like daytime day that I spent a full day, just trying to learn the religion of Islam. Um, I was taken out for street dawah, and I was like, well, how on earth would somebody like me be able to give dawah if I had at that time just converted the day before or the night before? And so they said, no, no, don't worry, just come with us. The fact that you're white is dawah for us. So just come with us. Most of them are like Pakistani or whatever. I'm not trying to sound racist or anything, but they're just like, just come with us because we're in Toronto. You just being with us is gonna attract attention. So I was like, I'll come with you guys. I don't know much, obviously. So but I'll see what I can learn and let's see if I can do anything that's useful. And so we went there, and I remember they had a long table there in front of one of the university campuses, probably the UFT, University of Toronto. And they had a bunch of pamphlets in front of them. And then they also had some small booklets, or at least one small booklet in particular, which happens to be on the screen. And that booklet is a brief illustrated guide to understanding Islam. And you may have seen this very same small booklet. I think it's around 60 something pages, and it was on the Dawah table. I ended up looking through this book and I was like, subhanAllah, I was so blown away that in these 60 pages, they show you the coming of Prophet Muhammad in the Bible. They show you, obviously, the true nature and story of Isa salam, and the clear comparison, the easy to see comparison between what the Quran is saying and what certain sections of the Bible are saying. It showed multiple scientific facts to prove that Islam is true, so that if somebody's even coming from an atheist mindset, they would be able to understand Islam on those grounds. Talks about the preservation of the Quran. So basically, some of the most major points from different angles to prove that Islam is true. And so, obviously, we mentioned science. So some of the established laws, like the law of gravity, the law of thermodynamics, the Big Bang, how that mountains have deep roots going into the ground. For example, Mount Everest, which is 9 kilometers in height, has a root going into the earth that is over 125 kilometers. It is far deeper going downwards than it is going upwards, kind of similar to an iceberg. But at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, was there any excavation equipment to see this 125-kilometer route of Mount Everest? There wasn't. But Allah Azza wa Jal, who's Al-Alim, obviously knows everything that He created. So when He says, وَجِبَالَ أَوْتَادَ in Surah An-Naba, He says that we've made the mountains with firm roots, with firm pegs. We now know that this is an established fact. An established fact that was basically discovered probably in the last couple hundred years. It wasn't that they knew this 1,000 years ago as far as science is concerned, but the Quran was already clear about these deep roots or pegs being in the ground. And this is an accurate translation because the word autada, it's like it does mean a peg or a stake, something that it's firmly rooted in the ground and helps to keep it in its position, just like a tent. A tent doesn't move around much because it's firmly secured in the ground, kind of like a tree. If obviously the tree wasn't old and decayed, when we're talking about mountains here, mountains are much stronger structures made out of rock. So these structures, this helps to firmly hold it into the ground. When something has deep roots, it's not easy to move such an object. Why we said, though, when it comes to scientific theories, though, we have to be careful. This is one of the examples. So when Allah Azza wa Jalla, when He spoke about the bee in Surah An-Nahl, the chapter of the bees, we find that He used the word for where basically the honey is. He used the word batuniha. Batuniha means essentially the stomach is the main linguistic meaning. But there's a secondary linguistic meaning, which means inside, right? Because like one of the names of Allah Azza wa Jal is Al-Batin. Al-Batin means the hidden, right? Another one of Allah's names is Al-Zahir, means the apparent or the one who makes Himself apparent. And obviously Allah reveals Himself to whoever He wills. And obviously, on the day of judgment, we'll be able to see Allah Azza wa Jal like seeing the full moon, meaning it will not pierce our eyes. When we look at the sun, we can go blind, but when we look at the moon, we don't suffer from gazing at the moon, meaning that we will be able to see Allah Azza wa Jal without perishing, without without that harming our bodies. And so, at the time when this was like a little bit after Islam, so this may have been probably around the Golden Age. There in science, people were starting to theorize that I'm saying from the scientific community. I'm not talking about the Muslims specifically. So the scientific community believed that honey originates in the legs of the bee. That's what the theory was at the time. Now we would come to know way in the future that science would finally figure out that the correct understanding is that it's actually in the stomach of the bee where the honey is actually produced. Now the Quran said the word batuniha. Batuniha has two meanings. The main meaning is stomach. And obviously the second meaning, which means internal, both meanings are accurate according to the Quran. But what some Islamic scholars at that time tried to do is they tried to bend the ayah or the translation or the meaning of it and tried to focus on the secondary meaning, which is just to be inside of something. So they said, well, because the word batan could mean stomach, but for something to be batin, it can also be hidden within. So we can say something is inside of the legs because it also has the meaning of to be inside. So they went with this. And then obviously later on, science realized that they made a mistake. The Quran never made a mistake. The Quran was always perfectly accurate and both meanings were correct according to what the Quran was using. So that's why it's better to always focus on established facts if we're going to do a comparison. We already have so many facts. We already have over 1,000 scientific proofs that we can look at from the Quran, on top of the historical miracles, on top of the future prophecies, on top of the linguistic miracles of the Quran. So we have so much that we can work with. We don't really have, we're not desperate really to look for every theory and try to connect it with the Quran. So in this case, the Quran was always correct by using the word that meant stomach and inside, because obviously the stomach fulfills both of these meanings, while as the meaning of just inside was not the correct understanding. And this is obviously due to the influence of science. Some scholars that were Muslim were trying to bend towards that when they didn't have to. These are some very famous du'at. Du'at is not the word du'a, which is obviously supplication. Du'at is the jam'a, is the plural of the word da'i or da'iya. Da'i is a male caller to Islam, a person who invites to Islam, and a da'iya is the female mu'annith version. So da'wah, calling or inviting people to Islam. These specific du'at that we have on the screen are very knowledgeable in the modern 21st century and can give you guys obviously a lot of insight as to how to deal with atheists, Christians, Jews, secularists. So when we look, for example, at somebody like Hamza Andreas Tsortsis, he's a Greek convert from the UK. He's like one of the main heads of IERA, Islamic Education Research Academy. He also has his own secondary Dawah organization called Sapience Institute, that him and Muhammad Hijab, they're involved in both organizations, but it seems like more so now he's being a little bit more involved in this in Sapience Institute. And there's a lot of video content you can watch on YouTube, a lot of recordings of him debating atheists. There are courses now of him explaining the Go-Rap method, obviously from his tangent and his viewpoint and from his experiences. He has a PhD, if I'm not mistaken, in philosophy, amongst his other credentials. And so he uses philosophy a lot to prove that Islam is true. And so he has, for example, the book called The Divine Reality, God, Islam, and the Mirage of Atheism. Using philosophy, he proves that Islam is true. But when he debates atheists, for example, he focuses mainly on natural science, biology, chemistry, physics, as well as the soft science of philosophy and logic to prove that Islam is true and to debunk a lot of the assumptions that atheists have about trying to negate a creator. And so he's debated people like Lawrence Krauss and other famous atheists. So he's worth looking into because he has, firsthand experience dealing with some of the elite atheists and putting them like flat on their face, basically. So very interesting personality to look at. If you're looking for somebody who can just explain comparative religion extremely well, there are a lot of people I could recommend for you. But the reason why I really want to recommend Dr. Zakir Naik before I was to, get into necessarily mentioning other names, I think actually if you remember lecture, I think 3 or 4 in this course, I mentioned a number of different figures, right? Ahmed Didat, Othman Farouk. There are many names and there are many du'at that we could look at. But Dr. Zakir Naik is a special gem because he's not just good at proving to Christians that Islam is true, he can also prove it to Hindus. He also speaks, or he speaks. So he speaks Urdu, so that obviously helps him in the India and Pakistan region. But he also understands the Hindu Vedas, and he can quote them directly. He can quote the Bible directly, and you would think sometimes he's probably memorized the whole thing, but if not, he just has perfect memory of whatever verses that he's memorized. Because there, for example, there's a clip of him and he outlines 22 contradictions of the Bible in less than 2 minutes, word for word, chapter, verse, reference, like a computer. And he does it on the spot without looking at any notes. And when you see him debating, he can do this when it comes to the Quran, when it comes to Hadith, when it comes to the Bible, when it comes to the Hindu Vedas. So that's why he's really he's a very special person of a very high caliber when it comes to dawah and comparative religious studies. And he's obviously an open spokesman. He gives conferences or attends conferences that have tens of thousands of people come. And normally at these big conferences, a lot of non-Muslims come. And you can just watch his YouTube videos. There are people en masse that accept Islam because of this man. May Allah preserve him and may Allah preserve Brother Hamza Sorsis for their amazing work. Like I said, a lot of this stuff is easily accessible on YouTube. Dr. Zakir Naik has also written several books, and I feel like his focus is mainly on comparative religion and proving Islam is true. So this is another very famous personality that you might want to look into, inshallah ta'ala. In Surah Al-Dhariyat, Allah Azza wa Jal, He used the word la musi'un, which means expanding. So when He was referring to the as-sama, the universe or the skies, everything, as-sama, like sometimes you'll see the translation, the heavens, not to be misunderstood with heaven in the sense of Jannah, because although that it can be included, the word heavens, when they translate the word sama or samawat, they're talking about skies or layers of skies. And normally when we talk about the first sama ad-dunya, we mean the entire universe that we see in outer space and including the sky above our heads. That's just a sama ad-dunya. And then we say that there are 7 skies, and it's actually the 6th and the 7th sky that has Jannah in it. But the first sky, we don't even see the limits of as-sama ad-dunya. We have not even reached the end of as far as these stars are, right? We see a certain number of stars, but we don't even see the limits of the first sky. And one time the Prophet ﷺ, he spoke about each sky, and he mentioned that the first sky is like a ring in the middle of the desert. And he compared it to the next sky. The next sky is like a ring in the middle of the desert. So this means that the universe is so massively huge that if we could even try to fathom how far away paradise is and how much bigger paradise is, it's honestly, it's too much for our mind to fully grasp. And the last heaven is like a ring in the desert compared to the footstool of the throne of Allah Azza wa Jal. So everything in his creation, his throne is bigger than everything in his creation, right? So then how can we even fully fathom, the creator of all creation, which is Al-Khaliq, the creator, meaning Allah Azza wa Jal. So in Surah Al-Dhariyat, Allah Azza wa Jal says He constructed as-sama, the sky, or the outer space or the universe the way that we see it, even though we can't even see the limits of this physical universe that we're in right now. And He is the one who is not just not just the one who expanded it, but is still expanding it. So it's mentioned in the context that it's still happening. And so Edwin Hubble, um, a typical scientist, not known to be Muslim, he said that, and he was a very renowned astronomer at the time. He understood the concept of physics and the redshift light pattern, and he noticed using his telescope that all the stars in the observable universe that we can see all have the redshift light pattern, which means every star right now is still currently expanding in an outwards direction. That means the universe is still continuing to expand, and this is now empirical evidence, observable evidence that you can see and nobody can deny. And obviously, if you were to reverse time, then everything would go back to one point. And Allah Azza wa Jal, He explained to us that the heavens and the earth were once joined together. He clove them asunder. And in this verse, He's explaining that He's continuously expanding the heavens. So we know that this is still obviously the case today. This has not changed. When it comes to a historical miracle, we talked about the differentiation between the time of Yusuf alayhi salam and Musa alayhi salam. What about something that happened shortly after this ayah was revealed, in a time that if you were to say this, people would have thought you were literally crazy? The Prophet ﷺ, when he received ayat from the surah of Surah Ar-Rum, Allah Azza wa Jalla said, غَلِبَتُ الرُّومِ في أدنى الأرض وهم من بعد غلبهم سيغلبون, which means that the Romans have been defeated in the lowest land. Adna al-ard, adna means the lowest, and ard means the earth, right? Ard can also mean a ground surface. So it's interesting that the word adna al-ard is being used here, because when it says غلبت الروم, they will be defeated. Ar-Rum, the Romans, or the Byzantines, as for some reason they like to call the Romans the Byzantines, and a lot of books of Sirah and books of history. So they're going to be defeated. Now, if you were to say this at the time that this ayah was revealed, why would people think that you're crazy? Because they thought that at that time the Persians were way more powerful than the Romans, and the Persians had just had a massive war with the Romans and almost completely wiped out the Romans. So it's kind of like a boxing match, and the two people are fighting and the one guy just got knocked out and he can barely walk, and for you to say that this guy now, let's say the guy has fallen down like 3-4 times, because these guys were superpowers for a while, the Persian Empire and the Roman Empire, and for somebody who's wobbling back and forth and they've been knocked out multiple times, for you to say that they're going to completely wipe out the opposite side was very far-fetched. And boxing is obviously not the best analogy, because that's just one person fighting another person. We're talking about an entire army, an entire civilization versus another civilization. Like, one civilization was almost completely wiped out in terms of their military. So for them to just make a swift return and to defeat the Persians, and to do this in less than 10 years, because this is essentially what the Quran alluded to, that this was mind-blowing, right? There was actually somebody who was willing to bet money against the Quran. He lost, but the point is that from the kuffar, that's how confident they were that there's no way that the Romans are going to be able to combat and defeat the people of Faras, of Persia. But obviously the kuffar, they messed up this time, and Allah already knew that the Romans were going to defeat the Persians. So obviously there was no harm in revealing this future prophecy. And again, why is Adna al-Ardi, why is this extra important? Why is this very significant? Is that not only did they defeat, not only were basically the Romans, they made this comeback against the Persians. Initially, they were defeated, but not only did they make this comeback towards the Persians, they did it in the lowest land, and not just a low land within a country, the lowest land on earth, in the entire earth. So Allah used the word the lowest land. And so what we find is that this battle took place, this pivotal battle that basically made the Romans the victorious, it happened in the Dead Sea Rift Valley in modern day occupied Palestine and Jordan on October 19th, This is a satellite image of 1984. So obviously at that time they didn't have satellites, but this is where they fought classically. So in the lifetime of the Prophet ﷺ, this battle took place in this geographical region. And then only in 1984 did we have the satellite imaging and the ability, after scanning the entire Earth, to say with confidence, this is the lowest altitude of land that is not completely submerged in water. So the altitude is 190 nautical miles or 350 kilometers. And this is below sea level, actually. So the surface of the Dead Sea is 1,292 feet, 394 meters below sea level. Now, you might be asking yourself, how is it below sea level? And then they ended up fighting in this area. Well, that's because in geography, sometimes you have land that's flat, and then you have random caves, or, not caves, valleys, like deep crevices. So the area around it is flat and dry, but then there'll be some valleys from time to time. And so this is the deepest valley that exists on the earth. And this is where they fought, the Persians and the Romans. And so we would not have known 1400 plus years ago, using science at that time, that this was indeed the lowest altitude, or the place of the lowest level below sea level on the entire earth that people could have actually physically fought on. It's just interesting to note that. We mentioned the issue about alam naj'al al-ardi alam naj'al al-arda mihada wa jibala awtada. Have we not made the earth as a wide expanse and the mountains as pegs? This is referring to Surah An-Naba. We give the example of Mount Everest, but there are many mountains throughout the world. Their roots vary, but either way, the roots are very deep. So this is a diagram showing you that the British Isles, they normally have roots that are 30 kilometers into the ground. North Germany, around that amount. The Swiss Alps, about 60 kilometers deep into the ground, is how deep the roots are. You can also see there's a place called Caucasus, wherever that is, around maybe 65 kilometers deep in terms of the roots of these mountains. So again, how would, from a scientific perspective, the Prophet ﷺ had access to this knowledge when it wasn't known according to the entire scientific community until several hundred years way into the future? When we look at human embryology, we can see that Allah Azza wa Jal, when He spoke about hearing and eyesight, He mentioned them in the order that people actually receive them in terms of their embryonic development, or the development of the baby inside of a human. So hearing was mentioned first. We now know, scientifically speaking, that the baby has the ability to hear way before it has the ability to see. And so it's just interesting of the chronological order that this is being mentioned in. We also have that Allah uses very specific words to describe the stages of embryology. So for example, He uses the word alaq, or the word alaqa, essentially, which you can translate many ways. It has many meanings. It has three main meanings. The word alaqa can mean a leech. The word alaqa can mean something that clings to something. And the word alaqa can mean a blood clot. And somebody might ask, how could all these three things have anything to do with the developing embryo? If you watch the video in the link description, I think on the actual IDA website, you guys should have access to this PowerPoint. But also, I think if you type in like embryo equals leech, Quran, the video might also pop up on YouTube, but it'll have a similar image to what you see on the screen here. And then basically there's a da'i that explains exactly how all three of these meanings are accurate. But to get straight to the point, alaqa means, so one of the meanings was leech. This is a side-by-side comparison. On the left side, you see at less than 21 days, at a microscopic level, the image of the embryo, which is smaller than the size of a kernel of wheat. You cannot see this amount of detail with the naked eye. You need to use a microscope. You need to have specialized equipment to be able to see something with this level of detail. The image on the left is the head of the developing embryo of a human. And if you look at the back end of a leech, you can see you basically have the exact same shape. You can also look at images where they basically have the same worm shape. They kind of squiggle the same way. They even have the same developing spine, the same proportions. It's kind of mind-blowing stuff that we're able to basically see this comparison, even though the embryo is below the size of a kernel of wheat, and this level of detail is unable to be seen with the human eye until obviously modern day types of equipment that we can use to verify this. How about the other two meanings? So we said alaqa can mean leech, but alaqa can also mean something that clings. So the embryo, what it's doing, it's clinging to the uterine wall at the beginning stages of embryology, and it's clinging from the connecting stalk. Right? This is obviously verified by famous embryologists. There was one that came to mind. He actually became Muslim after he studied these signs in the Quran and found that when he realized that they were all in perfect chronological order, his name is Professor Keith Moore. He actually ended up accepting Islam as a result of that. And he was the leading scientist of his time in the field of embryology. So that tells you something. So definitely the embryo, the alaqa, is a leech-like substance in the first 21 days, and it clings to the uterine wall. But what about a blood clot? Well, up until the 21st day, there's no pumping heart. So if blood doesn't pump, if it doesn't circulate, if it's stuck in one place, we call this a blood clot. So literally, before the heart is formulated on day 21, that this alaqa, which is clinging to the uterine wall, is essentially a blood clot because it doesn't have circulating blood until at least the 21st day. So all three of these meanings are precisely accurate, and this is way beyond the scope of science in the lifetime of Rasulullah. It was only something that was much later understood and discovered in the late 20th century, right? So hundreds and hundreds of years after the time of the Prophet. And as we said before, all the chronological steps of the Quran, from conception to embryo, the development of the fetus, all of these are mentioned in order. And we didn't even go into all the other signs related to the embryo, like the mugda. So like right after the alaqa, mugda means, I don't have a slide on it, but I just remember this from some of the dawah books that I've looked at. A mugda means a chewed up lump piece of flesh. And if you can look at pictures of this in that same dawah book that I told you about before, the guided illustrated guide to Islam. It shows that if you were to chew on a piece of gum or a piece of wet bread and you just bite on it and then you pull it out, the exact same shape of your incisors to your canines, to your premolars, to your molars, the same shape and the same curvature and the same change in thickness of that curvature of the teeth is the same size and shape and curvature and proportion of the developing spine of the human embryo. And he's explaining this is the mughda stage. And it said clumped up piece of flesh, because if you look at the embryo at this stage under a microscope, it looks like it has little clumps of like meat, essentially. It's the flesh of the embryo, but it looks like it's all chewed up and clumpy all around this leech-like thing that's developing. So with such accurate detail, in such perfect chronological ordering, Allah Azza wa Jal is describing, these different steps of embryology, on top of the fact that the Quran is a linguistic miracle, because we're going to come to know, if we haven't mentioned this already, that even the greatest linguist of the kuffar at that time admitted that there's nothing from the jinns and mankind that is similar to, he said, the speech of from Allah, but we're talking about the Quran here, right? He didn't want to admit that that was from Allah, but he knew that there's nothing that a human being has ever come up with that is equivalent to that of the Quran. And they tried. The Quraysh actually tried to make surahs, but it fell flat on their face. That's why they didn't keep going into battles of poetry. They went into a war with swords instead, because they realized that there's no way they can actually compete with the Quran. In Surah Al-Qiyamah, when Allah Azza wa Jal, He speaks about that He's going to be able to revive us, He mentions that He'll even be able to reassemble our idama. Idama means the bones in your body. and even to the point of your fingertips. Why are the fingertips so significant? In 1880, wasn't too long ago, Sir Francis Galton discovered that no individual human being on the face of the earth has identical fingerprints. And so Allah Azza wa Jalla is making it clear that not only can He resurrect us, but to the precise detail of even our fingertips. Why mention fingertips? Why not something else? Because obviously Allah already knows that this is the precise detail of which a human being, the unique markers that show the difference between one human being and another human being. So even to this extent, Allah will be able to resurrect you. So this is to get people to think, to take the Quran seriously, and to start, taking worshiping Allah seriously, because Allah is able to do everything. Allahu al-Qadir. Allah has power over everything. Then we come to the issue of pain receptors. There was this famous professor. He used to be a non-Muslim, but he visited a Saudi conference. It was the 8th Saudi conference held in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia. And he was learning about scientific facts in the Quran. And he was absolutely amazed at the fact that the Quran alludes to the fact that it's the skin that has to be renewed for people to keep feeling pain. Classically, many scientists used to think pain resided in the brain, and that basically if the brain was damaged, that was the reason why you could or could not feel pain. They didn't realize that there's actually individual nerve sensors underneath the skin, and that if you burn the skin completely, then you will not feel anything in that part of the body. You won't feel hot, you won't feel cold, you won't feel if somebody hits you with a baseball bat. You will lose complete sensation if all the nerves have been burnt off in that area. So when we look at the Quran, Allah Azza wa Jalla, He talks about renewing the skins so that they can continuously taste the adab, the punishment. And this is because the skin is intertwined with the nerve cells, the neurons that are responsible for sending the signal to the brain for a person to even be able to feel the pain of any pain. The next sign we're going to look at is water. And there are a couple things we can say about water. First of all, Allah Azza wa Jalla said in Surah Al-Furqan that we created every human being from water. This is now an established fact. Any organic living creature, whether it's a human, if it's a bug, if it's a bird, if it's a worm, all living creatures, plants included, are predominantly made out of water. There are cells in the human body that are between 50 and 90% water. So the cytoplasm, cyto means cell, plasm means liquid or fluid. The majority of all the cells in the human body are made of water. And so, obviously, like people have already told you most of your life, that your body needs to be extremely hydrated. Your body, on average, holds about 70% water. You can only last about 3 days without water because it's that important for life. And so, Allah Azza wa Jalla is telling us that He created all life from water. Then, another scientific sign, the ocean waves. Like we all know that there's waves on top of the ocean. How many of us know that there's actually internal waves below the surface of the sea? So layers amongst layers of ocean waves. That we would not be able to tell except with either revelation or special scientific equipment. So now we know that this is the case, that there are waves upon waves. The Quran alluded to this in Surah An-Nur, the chapter of light, right? And He explained that when He was speaking about the kafir, that they're talking about their kufr, that it's like darkness of waves upon waves, and that if one puts their arm deep into the ocean, they can hardly see it. And if Allah doesn't grant light for someone, there is no light. And why would you say if they put their hand into the ocean, they can hardly see it? Because you might see your hand from 1 or 2 meters underwater, but if you were to keep going, you would eventually get to a point, if you could stay alive, if you could keep breathing, that there's a depth that once you get to it, you can't see your hand anymore. It will vanish in front of your eyes. And why will it vanish? Is because we know now, based on science, is that once you get down to about 1,000 meters, light will not penetrate further than that. So essentially, you need to have some scuba gear with flashlights, or a submarine, or you'd have to be a fish with like glowing abilities. But you on your own as a human being, swimming below 1,000 meters, you will not be able to see anything. You will not even be able to get to 1,000 meters because you'll suffocate and die if you don't have special breathing equipment. But if you could go down to this depth, then you would discover this. So with modern day science and submarines, now we know this is a fact. We know that we start to lose, the proper understanding of certain colors start to become dimmer and dull, even if we go down 200 meters. But once we hit 1,000 meters, essentially things go pitch black. How would have the Prophet ﷺ known this in the middle of Arabia, in the middle of a desert, over 1,440 years ago, right? It's just unfathomable to think that a person could just guess something like this and then be completely accurate. Also, the issue of waves upon waves. Who would have thought that because we now have the scientific equipment to verify that there actually are internal waves underneath the ocean that cannot be seen with the eye, but can be seen with modern scientific equipment. Another book that's very useful would be Scientific Truths of the Quran by the Quran Project. You can download this for free and won't cost you anything. Of course, you could probably find a copy for print as well. What I'm saying here is that you can find this book easily for free. That goes through, I think, maybe at least 40 scientific signs. There's also a double part series with Dr. Zakir Naik. Each video is at least 2 hours long. So that means there's at least 4 hours and something, maybe 4.5 hours of content of him just mentioning one scientific fact after another. So if you need more, that should keep you busy for some time. And eventually you'll see much more science, how the universe is described as dukhan, as smoke. We now know if you've ever seen a nebula, if you've ever looked at the galaxies above our heads with even just images of the new, what's it called, that new telescope, the really good one, the James Webb telescope, way more vivid detail than we've ever seen before with even the more old school telescopes. That's supposed to be like the highest end telescope we have. We can see, huge nebulas throughout the cosmos, throughout the universe, and we can see that the beginning matter, or even if there's a supernova, when a star explodes, and you just see like the beginning materials of what it would take to build a star, you can see that it just looks like smoke. And Allah Azza wa Jalla explains that, about this material of stars looking like smoke, right? And it's not just that it looks like smoke. Smoke has a heat to it, right? Smoke has a look and it has a feel. It has a hot temperature, right? And so a star has both of these. And to say that they could have seen this with ease, again, this is very far-fetched. We have very, very high-tech telescopes now that allow us to see this kind of stuff in vivid detail. This is just showing the amount of detail that the Quran is showing us about multiple scientific phenomenon. Or when it comes to the salt and freshwater seas, how they don't mix, right? So we know that even if a river, like the Euphrates River, even though it goes directly into an ocean, still the freshwater and the ocean and the salt ocean, they don't mix, right? There's a barrier between them, but the people, they cannot see it. Science has proven there is definitely some kind of barrier there. They may or may not be able to explain some aspects of it, but what they cannot deny is it is there. Even if the stream of the river and the ocean, they meet directly, something is keeping the salinity different in the ocean compared to the river. The spherical shape of the earth, this is also talked about in the Quran. We already talked about the chronological stages of embryology, how the sun and the moon have their own orbit. This isn't even something that was understood properly until the last couple hundred years. People used to think that even when Nicholas Copernicus, said that there's the heliocentric model and the sun is the center of the solar system. He didn't say that the sun is doing its own orbit. But now that we can see complete galaxies, like we can see the galaxy of the Milky Way galaxy that we're in, we can see the Andromeda galaxy that's next to us. We can see that even all the galaxies, all the stars within the galaxies have their own orbits as well. Like this is the immense detail that the Quran is giving us. And obviously, science is slowly trying its best to catch up with a lot of these empirical, observable signs. So that, alhamdulillah, completes today's session. And alhamdulillah, we finished on time. I hope, inshallah ta'ala, that was of benefit to you guys. If there are any questions or comments, then feel free to ask now. Otherwise, we did good today in terms of our timing. Everything good, John? Do you any questions or comments, or is everything going well for you? So I'll assume that there are no questions or comments, and inshallah ta'ala, we'll complete our last two sessions and the following 2 Wednesdays, inshallah ta'ala, between 7 and 8 p.m. بإذن سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته